So I want to welcome you all to the Civilization Studies program lecture series entitled Futures Past of Humanity. And I want to acknowledge at the beginning that the series has been supported generously by the Gladys, Delmas, Krieble Foundation in New York. We also would like to thank our AUB supporters from the Asfari Institute who have offered us this beautiful space to have our series in, the Anis Maqdisi Program in Literature, and CASAR, the Center for American Studies and Research. And most importantly, I want to thank our research assistant, Rami Shukr, who has made everything really possible. And it's really, this is his series. No. But before I introduce our eminent speaker, Professor Alenka Zupančič, I want to say a few words about the title and aim of the series that is hosted by our program. Just a few all don't know, the CVSP program has historically been the core liberal arts program at AUB. And the lecture series this year, and this is our first event in it, will be part of CVSP's ongoing transformation from a great books program to an interdisciplinary program that is concerned with promoting the value of critical humanities for the liberal arts. So this is somewhat where the series fits into the activities or events that we hope to continue organizing from here on. The Future Past series is hosted by the CVSP program. And, we're called the Civilization Studies program, but the series is really concerned with, if I were to borrow from Freud, with civilization and its current discontents. So we've invited speakers from all over the world to Beirut to engage with our contemporary global condition that is characterized by crisis. There's a crisis in authority that we can see globally with the rise of what we could call obscene figures of authority everywhere. There's an ecological climate catastrophe, a mental health crisis, the pandemic, and the more general exacerbation of social inequalities on a global scale. And all these crises are accompanied by advancements in technoscience that may also have been unprecedented, from automation to developments in AI to the James Webster telescope and space exploration. We can perhaps say that we live in times of expanding possibilities coupled with dwindling horizons. And I guess the series Futures Past asks why this is so, why this is the condition that we are in. So rather than simply proclaim our impotence in the face of these complex and intertwined scales that are shaping our historical present, at CVSP, at the program, and the way the program is reimagining itself, we want to insist on the importance of the liberal arts and the humanities in particular for addressing both the conditions of our present and our imaginaries of a future that could be different. And what better place to think about alternative futures than Beirut, where the future increasingly looks more and more like the past. So Futures Past, the title of our series, carries a strange tense of the future anterior. It is a term first used by Reinhard Koselleck, the philosopher of history. And Koselleck described modernity as the accelerated temporality within which our horizons of expectation become more and more narrow. Modernity as a condition within which there's a collapsing distance, as he describes it, between our expectations and our experiences. So in other words, we increasingly conceive of our futures in the ways we have imagined them in the past. And as progress, as in a certain sense, what Koselleck says is progress is accelerating towards ends that we can already foresee. So the modern condition in this account is the condition of being haunted by imagined futures in the past. The condition whereby the future is more of a specter haunting us from the past than the possibility of something that is altogether different from the present. So our present conditions of crisis increasingly resemble, as you perhaps all would feel intuitively, and I'm sure Alenka will bring this up, scenes from movies that we've already seen. Dystopias, apocalyptic endings, imminent catastrophes, ecological wastelands, ruins of civilization as civilization, so on and so forth. These kinds of scenes that we've all somehow already seen. And the speakers in the series have been invited to address this uncanny temporality that we find ourselves in from various fields in the humanities and the social sciences. And more crucially, they will do so from Beirut in Lebanon, with the hope that what is happening here does not become the future past of the world at large. So from Lebanon, we can, in a certain sense, see the urgent need for futures other than those that have already passed. Okay, and I'll stop short of this kind of, sorry for this long introduction, but to kind of give you an idea about what the series is about and what it's really trying to question or ask in this invitation to our speakers. So we're pleased to begin our lecture series with Professor Alenka Zupančič, who is perhaps one of the very few philosophers in the world today who is attuned to this contemporary plight, to this kind of uncanny temporality that we're all in. Professor Zupančič works through these problematics from the intersections between philosophy, critical social theory, and psychoanalysis. She is a senior researcher in the Institute of Philosophy at the Slovenian Academy of Science and Arts, and she is a central figure in the Slovenian School of Psychoanalysis, along with Mladen Dolar and Slavoj Žižek. Professor Zupančič has published 7 books to date, as well as numerous articles and essays. I will only mention her most recent book, which everybody should read, What is Sex?, that came out with MIT in 2017, and will mention her forthcoming book, Let Them Rot, Antigone's Parallax, forthcoming in 2023 with Fordham University Press. So please join me in welcoming Professor Zupančič.
Hello. Thank you very much, Nadia, for this really warm welcome, as well as for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity again to come here. Every time I'm here, I really, really appreciate the time I spend here, the discussion that we have. So I'm sure this will be the same kind of opportunity. Rami, also thank you very much for everything you did to make this practically possible. Yeah. I guess you just, something came to my mind when you were talking about the future past, that actually not really the talk that I will give here today, but talk related to some of these similar themes. At one point, I gave it the title, Back to the Future of the End, or back to the, yeah, because I think it's really kind of, yeah, kind of future in the end of what, and what comes, if anything, comes after it. So let me just simply begin. A man says to his wife, if one of us dies, I will move to Paris. Okay, it's a joke, obviously, the joke that Freud uses in his text, Thoughts for the Times of War and Death, first published in 1915, which is to say immediately after the First World War. And he uses this joke to illustrate his argument that we or our unconscious don't believe in our own death, that it is impossible actually to really imagine our own death, for even when we do so, when we imagine it, we are still somehow present there as spectators of our own death. Of course, we know that death exists, and also experience it with others, with pain and irreversibility which come when people close to us die. But this knowledge of death and the capacity to talk rationally about death as natural, undeniable, and unavoidable changes nothing, says Freud, to the fact that in reality, however, we behave as if it were otherwise. Now, those familiar a bit with psychoanalysis will recognize in this formulation the template of the notion of the Disavowal, Verleugnung in German, as formulated already by Freud, and the formula perhaps most explicitly by Octave Mannoni, namely, I know very well that something is so and so, but nevertheless, I go on behaving as if I didn't know, as if it were otherwise. So Freud uses the term disavowal already in this paper on war and death, although one usually quotes his later paper on fetishism, much later, as the key reference in this regard. And he also makes Freud a very interesting observation regarding one of the forms that the disavowal of death can take, pointing out our habit actually to lay stress on the fortuitous, accidental causality of death, causation of death. Accident, disease, infection, advanced age. In this way, he says, we betray an effort to reduce death from a necessity to a chance event. In other words, by naming the immediate cause of death, we kind of obfuscate that as a necessity, even if we admit that it happens to everybody. So we are saying something like, everybody dies, of course, but accidentally. The fear of death that Freud also mentions, this Todesangst, he says it's in the sense only secondary, although it dominates us much oftener than we know, and it's usually the outcome of the sense of guilt or something like this. So the idea is that somehow we don't really believe that we will die, but the fear, the Todesangst that we are very much impregnated with is somehow already part of a further psychology. Then Freud names the war as one of the occasions which sweep away this mode of thinking that we cannot actually die, this mode of thinking about death, and that if there is war and people dying all around us, that this no longer allows for the death to be simply disavowed. But he uses even here a most interesting wording. He says, we are now forced to believe in death, which is kind of very interesting wording. So as if the impossibility to just take it in would remain, and with it the structure of the disavowal and of belief. We now believe that perhaps we can die. But very briefly put, I think there is nevertheless a certain paradox or ambiguity at work in Freud's considerations here. Namely, if the non-belief in our own death is a kind of fundamental fact, and also primarily in the unconscious on the level of the drives and so on, as Freud maintains, if we profoundly don't believe in our death, why would we need to disavow it? It is not like that deep down we know that we will die, we just won't accept it. It is rather than deep down we are sure we won't die, we just superficially and rationally accept it. So it's kind of an interesting configuration. So although it indeed rhymes strongly with the structure of the disavowal and its fundamental formula, I know well, but nevertheless, this non-belief in death also seems to lack something in order to really qualify as disavowal. And perhaps we could say what it lacks is simply the traumatism and its eventual relationship to our experience. So there is no traumatism that we try to disavow, or that could be a reason or motive for this disavowal. Of course, this further opens the question of a possible traumatism outside experience, which drives, for example, the compulsive repetition of unpleasant, painful experience that Freud also discusses in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and that actually Ray Brassier over there was writing about very, very powerfully in his book Nihil Unbound. But this suggests that even though something is not and cannot be a direct object of experience, it can nevertheless qualify as traumatic. So anyway, this question of what can induce something like an experience of death, even if it does not really involve death, is very important, but I would kind of just keep it aside. Before I move on to the center of my talk, I would just briefly make another excursion through psychoanalytic thinking, namely introduce Jacques Lacan, who has a very interesting take on this when he asks actually what exactly is it that makes our relationship to death, or the relationship between life and death, dramatic. Why are we not simply indifferent to our death as something situated beyond our experience, properly speaking? Now, you know that philosophy has answered by emphasizing our awareness of death, our being conscious of the fact that we will die our capacity to think it, to talk about it, to anticipate it rationally, and so on. But Lacan here has a slightly different answer. He suggests that our relationship to death is not actually only virtual in the sense of being symbolic, rational, something like this, and in the sense of being deprived of the real of its experience, but he maintains that death is actually kind of all the time present, precisely on the level also of experience through the drive. Also what he calls dead drive, but as dead drive as the template of all drives. So here there is a slight difference in respect to what Freud maintains. So he maintains that there is this kind of surplus that keeps disturbing our relationship to our body, and this is what kind of accounts for this dramatic relationship also between life and death. Obviously, this bodily experience is there because of the symbolic, because of the fact that we speak, but it is nevertheless a bodily experience, and it is irreducible back to speech or to the symbolic. So according to Lacan, it is the fact that we are kind of situated within an unsought portion of what he calls jouissance, enjoyment, that makes different attitudes towards death possible to begin with. I'll just read you a very brief quote. He says, the dialogue of life and death becomes dramatic only from that moment when enjoyment intervenes in the equilibrium of life and death. The vital point, the point where a speaking being emerges, is this disturbed, dérangé relationship to one's own body, which is called jouissance. So perhaps Lacan's point here could be summed up as follows. The relationship between life and death is or would be indeed trivial if it were not necessarily interrupted, complicated from within. If our life was not somehow interrupted and complicated from within. Something third comes between life and death and complicates their indifferent relationship. For us, implicate one in another. So, of course, this is not to say that this enjoyment, this jouissance is something that kind of scares us to death or something like this. No, it is there precisely to complicate or introduce a certain loop in the life itself. And this loop is not simply symbolic. And something similar, and this is actually what I'm trying to get to, because I will take this as something that will lead us a step further. Something similar is at stake, also according to Lacan, in the relationship between our being awake and sleeping. Another brief and simple quote. He asks, what in fact does it mean to be asleep? What is at stake is to suspend the ambiguity at work in the relationship of the body to itself, namely the enjoyment, le jouir. When we are asleep, the body wraps itself up, rolls up into a ball. To sleep is not to be disturbed, and enjoyment is disturbing. One is usually disturbed, but when one is asleep, one can hope not to be disturbed. This is why, starting from here, everything else disappears. There is no longer question of dissemblance, nor of truth, nor of surplus enjoyment. Since all this is related, it's the same thing. Yet, as Freud tells us, the signifier keeps working during our sleep as well. And of course, here with this last remark, we raise the specifically Freudian question of dreams and of that surplus enjoyment or truth or semblance that the working of the signifier can kind of smuggle into a dream, and which eventually disturbs us, even when we are fast asleep, rolled up into a ball, waking us up from within the dream. And the edge at play here is, of course, the same rap that upon which Hamlet's famous monologue dwells, you know, to sleep, to die, perhaps perchance to dream. And then he says, but no, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. So I won't pursue this any further. I mostly brought it up to be able to point out the ambiguity of the trope of waking up, also and specifically in our contemporary social context. Namely, and as also Lacan perspicuously suggested, it often happens with dreams that we wake up so as to go on dreaming. This is particularly true for nightmares and generally true for the dreams in which a real appears that is more real, more traumatic and shattering than simply our everyday reality. So in response, we wake up and proclaim to be awake in order to be able to continue to dream, that is to say, to continue to exist untouched, unscattered by the real that has just appeared. So in this sense, you see the real nightmare is precisely one from which we cannot wake up. When we wake up, the nightmare is over, so to say. And so my point would be that this way of waking up, or that in this way the waking up functions in a strange complicity with disavowal, with this Verleugnung, to which we will return in a moment. And if we look at the contemporary crises that befall us, Nadia had already enumerated several of them. They befall us one after another, and this actually now starts to look like something like a serial crisis, like serial murders or serial crisis, from climate change to financial crisis to COVID pandemic to Ukraine war to the global energy crisis, as well as more and more perceptible tectonic shifts that indicate the collapse of capitalism as we used to know it, this classical functioning of it, and its possible transformation into something even worse. Do we not deal in all these cases, and in spite of their obvious differences, with a situation where we wake up so as to be able to continue to dream? Each time we proclaim that this is now a complete game changer, that we have woken up from the end of history and its lull. Yet at the same time, we, or at least those who kind of keep the machine functioning on this elite level, go on more or less as before, as if nothing really happened, or else want to regress to some anterior, supposedly better state. This is certainly a lot. There is certainly a lot of declarations and commotion surrounding this waking up. But in the midst of all this commotion, we seem to go on dreaming. And you remember that in previous decades, we talked a lot about the need to change. But now it seems that the reality has overtaken us. Things are changing quite dramatically. So no wonder that the talk about the need to change has passed from the critical voices to the mainstream discourse, where it basically means adapting to the new reality of something that looks gloomier every day. It means we need to change our ways of being in order to accommodate these tectonic shifts, this real that has hit us as if from the outside. We have this impression that something is really happening to us from the outside, and I think we could really relate this to Freud, what I said before, his observation that one way of disavowing something is to emphasize its fortuitous accidental character. This is just happening to us. So in our case, disavowing something to emphasize, this would be the kind of more deeply systemic causes of these crises springing necessarily from the existing global system. We still think it's just accidental. Okay, to resume, a change, a major tectonic change is already happening, whether we like it or not. And although it's not equally perceptible in all parts of the world, it is there. It didn't wait for us to decide that we now really wanted to put an end to what was going on before and say something like, to paraphrase a phrase from Monty Python's, that's it, and now for something completely different. The world as we knew it is really falling apart, changing dramatically all around us and right in front of our eyes. In most cases, it's certainly not what we had in mind when we were critically demanding a change. But the change is still real and ongoing. It is penetrating and shaking up all spheres of our life. So we sense this, we know this, yet to some extent at least, we seem to be caught in a kind of a crazily cheerful mood of the show must go on. I think greatly captured in Adam McKay's film Don't Look Up, this crazy cheerfulness, which the word cringe would seem to describe very well, and which could be summed up perhaps with the following pun: the world is ending, but hey, it's not the end of the world. And I think that this cheerful attitude is mostly not due to the fact that some other organization of the social is now possible and we are actively like thinking of it, celebrating it, engaging with it, but it's rather related to a disavowal precisely of this change that is taking place. It has to do with depriving the end of its reality rather than with looking beyond it or in some other direction. We don't strive to appropriate the change, but mostly lose our breath trying to keep up with it. And in this situation, a very strange and perhaps unexpected complicity arises between the functioning of the economic and the political elites and the conspiracy theorists. And I will return to this a bit later. To be sure, there is also a lot of catastrophism around. Fascination with the apocalypse, with various disasters and prophecies of doom, with the spectacle of it. Yet far from being the opposite of disavowal, this vivid catastrophism constitutes, I think, an important and integral part of it. The end of the world thus appears as a kind of general spectacle environment, a coulisse of the stage on which we go on with our business as usual. Images of apocalypse are precisely the kind of phantasmatic screen obfuscating or protecting us from the real apocalypse, which has already started and is not looming, waiting for us somewhere in the future. So disavowal. I will now say a few things about disavowal, also known as fetishist disavowal. Disavowal is not the same as denial. I apologize for those to those here who are very familiar with this. Just very quickly, disavowal is not the same as denial. It brings about this split between knowledge and belief. I know very well that there is no X or that there is X, but I keep believing that there is no or that there is. So I keep behaving and acting as if I didn't know what I know and what I'm able to state as my knowledge. So it's very different. It's not the same as repression in these classical psychoanalytic terms, because people we are with the disavowal one is perfectly capable of rationally talking about it, acknowledging it. So there is no amnesia. I know and I can acknowledge some fact, yet the latter seems to be deprived of its reality, of its meaning, of its consequences, of its significance. So it is not exactly that I unconsciously keep behaving or believing, what I know to be otherwise. I don't need this for the fetish beliefs in my stead. This is the structure and the beauty, let's say, of this structure. And as already pointed out by Mannoni, whereas the phrase "I know well, but all the same" is the kind of a general trademark or the signature of disavowal, fetishist will never say the second part. I mean, he will never say "but all the same," since his "but all the same" is his fetish, precisely. The belief is outsourced to the fetish, while we know perfectly well how things stand and are able to talk about it. So to make this more palpable, perhaps, I will borrow an illustration of how fetish works from Slavoj Žižek, who in the book In Defense of Lost Causes recounts a story about a man whose life was diagnosed with acute breast cancer and who died 3 months later. The husband survived her death unscattered, being able to talk coolly about his traumatic last moments with her. So the question was, how? Was he a cold, distant, unfeeling monster? Soon his friends noticed that while talking about his deceased wife, he always held a hamster in his hand, her pet object and now his fetish, the embodied disavowal of her death. And when a couple of months later the hamster died, the man broke down and had to be hospitalized for a long period. So this is how, what I meant when I said before that the belief is outsourced to the fetish. You can talk about some traumatic event absolutely rationally. It's just that there is also this object that kind of is the embodiment of your disavowed belief in the opposite. But now I believe that there is perhaps a further twist of this structure that appears with the contemporary nowadays functioning and forms of disavowal. And I describe this further twist as a configuration in which knowledge about some traumatic reality gets strangely redoubled and starts playing itself the role of the object fetish that protects us against this reality. Again, if you recall Žižek's example, hamster example, and I will read you just the conclusion that he draws from there, a political conclusion in that context. He says, so when we are bombarded by claims that our post-ideological cynical era, in this era, nobody believes in the proclaimed ideals, when we encounter a person who claims he has been cured of any beliefs, accepting social reality the way it really is, one should always counter such claims with the question, okay, but where is your hamster? The fetish which enables you to pretend to accept the reality as the way it really is. So, and the point I'm trying to make is that in a kind of intriguing short circuit, it is the knowledge itself about how things really stand that is our hamster, enabling us to supposedly accept the reality of this that this knowledge refers to. For instance, just think about how important it is today to declare that you are not naive, not deceived or duped, how important it is to know how things really stand, to know what is behind, to know that the other is unreliable and full of tricks, but above all, to let others know that you know. This is even more important. We are much more concerned with the possibility of deception than with the traumatic dimension of the real. And just think how even the craziest and weirdest conspiracy narratives are anchored in this will not to be deceived more than anything else. The belief, let's say, that the earth is flat is not really a quarrel about the shape of the earth, but an attempt to point out the massive deception that has been systematically going on for hundreds of years. This is basically, if you listen to, and this is what they claim. So it's not simply that flat earthers refuse science and scientific proofs. Very often they use it and they do their own measurements and follow the same scientific logic just to kind of prove that at the same time it's all one big scam, a deception to make us believe that the earth is around. So so there is this kind of strange, I think, being, okay, I will return to this. There is another permutation, I think, that also appears with this formula, I know well, but nevertheless, namely the permutation that appears at the level of the second bit, but nevertheless, which in the classical version presupposes an opposition, contradiction. And I think that really the structure of fetishist disavowal, I know very well, but nevertheless continue to believe the opposite, kind of mutates now into something like, I know very well, and this is why I can go on ignoring it. Or else I acknowledge it, and this is why I can now forget about it. So in a kind of folding over itself, knowledge takes the structural place of the fetish that helps us ignore some traumatic reality or deprive this reality of its reality, precisely. All that is important is that we know everything about it, that we are nobody's fools, and that we let others know that we know it. Again, letting others know, proclaiming, flagging our knowledge is a crucial element. And of course, the apocalyptic coulisses, the rhetorics of the end is part of that. You know, yeah, the world is coming to an end. We know it. It's there. Everything is falling apart, so we can go on as before. And I will now take another, I think, very nice example of this structure from the movie that I already quoted, Don't Look Up. I really like the movie. I hope many of you have seen it. You know, it's this kind of not really allegory. I mean, the story is that this deadly comet is about to, and for certain, it's all the measurements are 100% sure, hit the Earth and destroy it completely. And now how then people react to it, and it's supposed to be a kind of allegory of the climate crisis. I really think it's extremely nicely done, precisely, because many critics, kind of even leftist critics, thought that the movie was really too grotesque, too exaggerating, undermining people's intelligence. But I think it is reality that is undermining our intelligence. I mean, the movie, I mean, you cannot make a comedy that is more ridiculous than precisely the way we really react to this kind of thing. So I really think there is something there that this movie needs to be defended. But anyway, I will just take this, and I also like the way it doesn't play into this simplistic division between, you know, the terrible simply conspiracy theorists or Republicans and the good liberal Democrat elites. Because if you remember the president, it's although she kind of, I mean, some people see her as a female embodiment of Donald Trump, but there is a kind of, there is not a kind, there is a shot in the Oval Office when there is a picture on her desk where she's kindly, friendly, or perhaps merely embracing Clinton. So that there is a clearly that this is not simply, yeah, this is Trump and the rest of us are normal. Anyway, but the example that I wanted to quote of this specific structure that I was referring to is one of the many ingenious formulations that are there in the movie, and that encapsulates this very well. So there, at some point, you see the following newspaper headline: "Deadly comet is about to hit the Earth. Will there be a Super Bowl?" You know, I really think this formulation does in fact render the gist of the configuration much much better than a direct denial would. You know, if the headline read, "There is no deadly comet," or "It's all a lie," or something like this. It's the end is near. Will there be a Super Bowl? So, and I think here you can see how it is almost as if the first part of the sentence, the declared knowledge about the approaching of the end of the deadly comet, needed to be there in order for us to then peacefully talk about the Super Bowl. All we want to talk about is the Super Bowl, and the acknowledgement of the deadly comet is there just as a kind of courtesy requirement, like greeting the other and asking them how they are before starting a real conversation. But precisely as such, this first part is absolutely essential for the functioning of disavowal, as it is for our social ties when we ask how you are. So it could not simply be left out and say, this is not important, we want to move directly to the Super Bowl. No, you need precisely this. It is again what makes the business as usual attitude of discussing the Super Bowl possible. And there is yet another thing I believe that this film, this movie makes very palpable, namely that, and contrary to what we like to think, Disavowal is not simply on the side of conspiracy theorists and some whatever blind, stupid masses, but primarily on the side of the elite, precisely, of the supposedly rational mainstream of the carriers of economic power. And conspiracy theorists are rather a kind of symptom, or I would argue, an embodiment of the grotesque unconsciousness of the elite. And of course, the elites need conspiracy theorists to point their finger at them, to contrast them with their own supposed rationality, and to make the rest of us kind of blind to their own madness. So let me try to unpack this a bit. Conspiracy theorists are right in one point. The elite really like it when there is a threat in the air, and they like to cash on it. For instance, making huge amounts of money with strategies of preventing it, attending to it, taking care of it. But in order to cash in on that threat, to dedicate their time to making money based on that threat, they must not fully and genuinely believe in its reality, that it's really kind of the end of the world, even if they keep talking about it. In other words, they need to disavow it, that is, to continue to behave in their everyday business life as if the danger is not really real or not really that big. Now, the conspiracy theorists, for them, this constitutes yet another proof that the danger doesn't really exist and is merely being staged by the elites in order to subdue us. The elites are not crazy, goes the argument, they know exactly what they are doing. There is the whole thing is a master plan. And this is why this very presupposition is what actually makes it possible for the elites to continue to derealize the danger, the catastrophe which they are themselves causing. And I think it is here that resides the key mistake of conspiracy reaction, a mistake to which we would have to respond something like, no, it's worse. The elites really are so crazy. They not take the danger seriously. And this is precisely why we should truly be scared. No, they don't know what they are doing. They have no master plan beyond keeping themselves in business. Instead, the conspiracy theorists tend to declare the unconscious, this crazy unconscious of the elite, their pathological madness posing as rationality, to be the objective reality. So the reasoning goes as follows: since the elites clearly don't really believe in the danger, there is no danger. And in this precise sense, I claim the conspiracy theorists are basically kind of staging, embodying the very unconscious of the elite, that the elites themselves are disavowing. That is the very madness on which their rationality leans in what is a classical case of disavowal. And of course, no wonder then that the so-called elites tend to regard conspiracy theorists with horror. It is certainly distressing to see your own unconscious returned from the real, from the outside, to see it exist out there. But it can also come obviously handy to be able to point the finger to these crazy others from which your rationality is allegedly saving the world. You know perhaps that a very, very popular reference of conspiracy theorists is the film The Truman Show, the Peter Weir's film, made in a very different time, but still, it's a very popular reference among them. In which, if you remember, the audience of a gigantic reality show is being entertained watching the hero of the show conducting his life without knowing, again we have this question of knowing or not knowing it, that he is actually part of the reality show. So everything, every little piece of reality is staged for him, including the firmament, the sky. Everyone there is is there in order to create a fictitious world for this one person, to convince him of its reality and to keep him there. And I think actually what is happening today is something very different. First, the elites are creating the fictitious world primarily for themselves, not for us. They are staging it so as to be able to continue to believe that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with it, and then with some ingenuity and some adjustments, it can simply go on toward an even brighter future. However, although they are staging this for themselves, the crazy belief has an effect on us as well. While watching them continue with their business as usual, we also start to believe that nothing is fundamentally wrong and that we just need to make perhaps some adjustments and amends. But I really think here lies the mistake. The Truman Show today is nothing but the so-called real world of the capital, of stock markets, banks, financial markets, transactions, and balloons, which the elites are putting up, often with our help, mainly for themselves. And clearly their benefit, their profit is double, financial or material, as well as psychological, namely the psychological gain provided by the fetishist disavowal of the catastrophe. And their fetish is precisely also this business as usual. Whereas the real catastrophic effects take their toll mostly on the opposite end of the social ladder. And I think that conceptually, if we take this notion seriously, this notion of the disavowal, it may also help us explain what looks like, I would say, a crazy heroism accompanying the crazy cheerfulness that I mentioned earlier. What I mean by crazy heroism is that it seems that we would quite literally rather die than let ourselves be scared to death by what is coming if we let the change in the events simply take their natural course. We are more afraid of being scared to death than of actually dying. This is how I would describe this. And this brings me to the last point that I want to introduce and discuss today, and which I propose to call the difference between two survivals. You know, Lacan has this famous discussion of Antigone between two deaths, but I would talk today about the difference between two survivals, two meanings of this term. There is a certain ambiguity and paradox surrounding today the notion and the discussion of survival, I think. It's clear that the logic of what is called sheer survival has a pretty bad reputation in contemporary, but not only contemporary, emancipatory philosophy. It basically means that we merely cling on to our lives in the absence of any idea or truth or real struggle, hence sustaining the status quo. So the ideological domination of primum vivere is denounced in this perspective as oppressive, and sometimes then contrasted by other cultures or civilizations that are less decadent, more vital than ours, and so on. And I think this is kind of interesting. This is just a parenthesis, that there is a certain self-perception and self-accusing of the West as decadent that is itself part of a certain perverse game, I would say. But we often hear that also that contemporary biopolitics reduces us to bare life, or that it enslaves us by making us hostages also again to the mere survival. But I'm not at all sure that this is what is happening. I mean, the way, if you just look around, do we really care that much about our survival? I think it's almost the opposite that seems to be the case, and on kind of on a very, very fundamental empirical level even. But in any case, I think that perhaps there are two quite different notions or modalities of survival that are being confused in these debates and this kind of social diagnostics. And in order to kind of distinguish perhaps between them, I would propose to return to Hegel actually, and articulate very briefly this difference between two modalities of survival and fear, as follow from this famous section from the phenomenology of spirit that is called the master and slave, famously, or the lord and the bondsman dialectics. So you probably know the basic settings, that there is this setting or this scene almost in which there is the confrontation to life and death struggle between two self-consciousness. So there is this life and death struggle, who is willing to go to the end, who is not. And at some point, one of the two parties, which then later becomes the slave, in mortal fear, the slave chooses life. So decides that still he would prefer to live. But according to Hegel and what follows from this whole dialectics, this does not mean that the slave thus forever condemns himself to living in the modality of sheer survival without any idea or truth. So the other self-conscious to become the master is prepared to go all the way and die to rid their life. Yet this also doesn't mean that this master is henceforth immune against the logic and, let's say, the straitjacket of the survival mode. Hegel's point is rather that the actual freedom, also in respect to demands of immediate survival, cannot be chosen directly. Neither one can choose it directly. There is no, so there is this dialectics that takes place from that point on. And in this sense, also we could say the master's choice is no more correct or heroic than the slave's. Although there is difference and there are nuances, I won't go into this. But what I want to emphasize is that this is not simply about the fact that obviously we first have to choose life if we want to make something of it and so on. The point that Hegel is making here is slightly different, namely it's about the fact that we need first to experience what he calls the trembling of pure negativity, this mortal fear, if there is to be any kind of freedom further on. So let me just brief you this short passage from Phenomenology. He says, servitude does in fact, I mean, in this dialectics, contain within itself this truth of pure negativity and being for itself, for it has experienced this in its own essential nature. For this consciousness, that servitude consciousness, has been fearful not of this or that particular thing, or just at odd moments, but its whole being has been seized with dread. For it has experienced the fear of that, the absolute master. In that experience, it has been quite unmanned, has trembled in every fiber of its being, and everything solid and stable has been shaken to foundations. End of the quote. So this is for Hegel the very kind of thing out of which human freedom actually can arise. The point that I would like to make in relationship to previous discussion, and without going any further into Hegel and many other facets of this dialectics, is simply this, to say that if the choice of life is not a forced choice, forced because of mortal fear precisely, as in the case of slave, but appears as natural and immediate, then we have no means of accessing it and repeating this choice. Since there is nothing to repeat here, we can only cling on to our lives without even knowing why we bother. In other words, the problem is not a slave who in mortal terror has bent before a master or before the death as the absolute master. For him or her, there is still possible emancipatory future freedom even. The problem, I think, is with the idea precisely of a neutral man, a neutral person who is neither a master nor slave, but just freely creates his life and personality, changes roles, whose whole being has never been seized precisely, also not symbolically with dread, with the experience of negativity. So paradoxically, what condemns us to the logic of survival without any idea of truth is not the experience of mortal fear, but rather the absence of this experience, or also of the kind of symbolic experience of this. I'm not simply, like in this case, precisely, this is nobody dies in these dialectics, but the experience of this mortal fear is there. And the cut it represents, cut precisely into the immediacy of our lives. And then also the subsequent subjectivation in one way or another of this cut, of this negativity. There is thus an important difference, I think, precisely between this mortal fear, erzittern in the face of pure negativity, as Hegel terms it, in response to which we choose to survive, and on the other hand, survival as simply an immediate fact of life, so to say, something that comes with life, and conservation and maintenance of life known as primum vivere. So I think there are two very different facets and impulses of survival involved here. And to say, as I suggested earlier, that today it mostly seems that we would rather die than allow ourselves to be scared to death, that this kind of points in the direction of this second alternative, this kind of precisely just we don't even know why, and appears as its symptom. We could say also that we fear dread more than death. And back to the beginning, we could ask if this is because dread presents something like a lived experience of death, whereas death itself does not necessarily. But I think more could be said about this. And I'm coming closely to my final point and conclusion. I think we could perhaps further relate this to another also Hegelian point, namely the way in which he conceives the difference between what he calls Verstand, understanding, and reason, Vernunft. I want to introduce this. I mention it because somebody else than Hegel, namely Maurice Blanchot, a French philosopher, draws our attention to the possible importance of this distinction in an essay written back in 1964, in the context and the peak of the Cold War, when the possibility of total nuclear destruction was literally just a push of a button away. And you will see why I'm bringing in this essay, an essay which also has a truly inspired title. It is called "The Apocalypse is Disappointing." And I think this essay, again written in 1964, resonates strongly in our present social and political contexts in on many levels. I have written on it extensively elsewhere, so I would just like to bring in here one particular argument that relates directly to this issue of courage, fear, and survival. And this is not even his main argument. I just think it's something that comes into the discussion, and it's quite interesting. So drawing on this Hegelian distinction between the notions of Verstand, understanding, and reason, Vernunft, Blanchot's diagnosis is kind of, to put it very simply, that humanity is stuck at or caught in this logic and in the logic and functioning of understanding, and also of the abstract negation that is related to it. One of his points is precisely that the whole idea of the atomic bomb and what it can do was that it really had wake us up, because it was the first time that the humanity actually became aware of the fact that it can disappear as a whole in a moment. And he has this interesting point in saying that it is also the first time that humanity started to think about itself as a whole, precisely because as a whole, because of this negation. This is why the abstract negation. We can lose it all, everyone can disappear, and this is how the humanity, for the first time, started to even imagine itself as something that is more than just a multitude of persons. So there is this kind of community emerging, but also only in the negative way, only by, if we think about that we will lose it all, only in this negation the all kind of appears. Okay, but this is nothing, this is not something that I will discuss here, this part of it. So his diagnosis is that humanity is caught in this logic of understanding, Verstand, and its modality of abstract negation. Understanding, he writes, is cold and without fear. It analyzes the danger, subjects it to its measures, looks for the solutions, strategies, adjustments. This work is very useful. It demystifies the apocalypse and shows that it is possible to live with it. And the normalization, adaptation that I mentioned at the beginning is precisely this. We are learning how to make do with the apocalypse. And Blanchot continues, it shows, so this work of analysis and so on, it shows that the alternative of all or nothing, which turns the atomic weapon into a quasi-mystical force, is far from being the only truth of the situation. Yes, this lesson of understanding is sound. Only it is almost too sound, because it exposes us to a loss of fear. The fear that misleads but also warns. So this is the last sentence of this essay, and it doesn't explicate in what sense the term fear is used here. And my kind of interpretative intervention would be to cut the sentence short, exposes us to a loss of fear, full stop, and relate it to Hegel's discussion precisely of the dread in which pure negativity makes our whole being tremble. And obviously, the quoted passage from Blanchot also brings us back to several of the themes that I brought up earlier in the context of disavowal. It brings us to the importance of this knowledge, cold analysis, calling things by their names, maintaining no illusions, as well as to what looks like this crazy heroism of our attitude toward the changing world and toward catastrophes that are becoming part of it, what I called we would rather die than let ourselves be scared shitless. And this is precisely the crazy heroism that is also, I think, part that resonates in this passage. So what to make of this loss of fear? It does not mean that we have become, I think, so brave that we are no longer afraid of anything. It does not speak about our courage, but perhaps rather about our perception of the world in which, with necessary adjustments, everything can be solved. We refuse to admit that there is no visible solution on the horizon, or more precisely, we refuse to admit that even if there is a solution, we can imagine what the solution would be, but there is no agent, global agent to implement it, to make it happen. So instead, we would quite literally rather die than admit this hopelessness and let it really scare us. In our apocalyptic world, in this smooth run of normalization and adaptation to one problematic thing after another, when our attitude toward the world is so sound that it is actually all too sound, true scares, of course, appear from time to time. But again, can they really scare us to death? So to say, can they scare us so much that we start fighting, organizing for our lives, and switch precisely from the survival mode of coping with things one day at a time? Can they kind of scare us to a common struggle for our future lives? Obviously, there is the rub. But I simply would like to insist on the difference between these two meanings of survival, that they are not the same, and sometimes to really fight for the survival is not at all without idea in resonance of truth. And of course, and I will conclude with this, to say that nothing can scare us to death is not the same thing as to say that we don't feel scared and insecure. Of course we do, most of the time even. But precisely, I think this living in fear and insecurity is quite different from this experience of mortal fear that I briefly mentioned before, and particularly of the cut that it presents in the immediacy of our lives. And it could be a symbolic cut. This is not to say that we need some kind of extremely terrible experience, but it's really, it could just be a symbolic cut that would make this experience palpable. Okay, we thus have this kind of a dubious courage to endure to the end, and the end still persists here precisely as the ultimate point on the horizon, as well as the source of morbid fascination, you know, apocalyptic fascination. And it is also here, I think, that the shift of perspective is needed. Today, the most lucid analysts do not warn us against what will happen if we press the wrong buttons. They rather insist that the wrong button has already been pressed, and several of them. So apocalypse is already started and is becoming an active part of our life, of our world, such as it is. It is not waiting for us somewhere in the future, but is dictating our social, economic, environmental conditions as we speak. And you perhaps know that in his play, The End Game, Beckett has this famous line, the end is in the beginning and then you go on. And I would perhaps just to really conclude, slightly modify this for the present argument and say the end is in the middle, in the midst of crisis, and we need to keep returning to it. And it's not a finality. It is not what the crises lead to. The end is not the end point. The end point is finally insignificant. We should think of it as, we shouldn't think of it as an end point, but more as something like an impasse or a dead end, to which we need to be returning, coming back again and again, thinking it. So when it comes to the end, perhaps only repetition can really make a difference. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you, Alenka. So we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. Yes.
Thank you. So good evening. My name is Salim Adib. I'm a medical doctor, a behavioral epidemiologist, and I teach public health in this university. Thank you for a very interesting essay that, of course, has hit on several important issues, and I think I did not get all of them. But there was an aha moment for me in your essay when you made the difference between denial and disavowal. On my way in, I thought that we were going to talk about denial.
Mm-hmm.
And denial, and you have a very interesting way of separating the two entities. And I can see clearly now that, yes, they are different. So denial, I know the facts, but they just don't fit my situation. And I have a coping strategy that will help me not care about this knowledge. Chekhov was a doctor, and he'd been sick for 10 years. And the night of his death, he writes to his daughter, "I've never felt better than the way I'm feeling tonight." The second day he was dead. That's denial, probably. We tend, as doctors, to deal with it in a quaint fashion. We believe that it's an ally sometimes, sort of part of the palliative care. If we have to tell people that they're going to die because they have this disease and it's going to kill them, but we do hope that they will find a way of working with denial so that it doesn't affect them too much. In a sense, it's a nice ally. Disavowal is something else, as you put it, I can look at it now and I can see why it's scary. I know the knowledge because that's what everybody is saying, but I don't think that it's true, and I think that you're hiding the truth, and I'm going to act upon this. And in our world, it's a very sick situation because I cannot approach it without judgment, because it's a situation where you're saying there is global warming, but it's just a fluctuation of the climate. You're saying there is a virus and you're giving a vaccine, but I think that it's just an attempt on my democratic rights. And so the second concept cannot be quaint. It's not an ally. It's sometimes actually an adversary in our fight for the welfare of the human beings to which we have sworn our life, or some of us have sworn their lives. So my question here is one, probably more to all of us. We know how to call denial in Arabic. We have a word for it, inkar. We're going to have to think of how to call it in Arabic, how to call disavowal in Arabic, because we need to explain this to people who are increasingly more frequent in our culture to believe that there is some sort of big plot out there and that we don't know everything, and we need to talk to them in a language that they relate to. But a more specific question for you is, I cannot approach disavowal without being judgmental, and I perceive it as a foe. What do you feel about it? Can we turn it into a friend? Is it going to ultimately work towards the wellness and happiness of human beings? Is there a silver lining to this animal?
To disavowal, you mean? Thank you very much for all your comments and this question. I think if there is a silver lining to the disavowal, it is like the edge of the knife. Very silver, very glittering, but also very deadly. So I don't think there is this kind of a silver lining in this obvious sense. But actually, your comments, I perceive them also as a kind of not really criticism of what I was saying, but of not making perhaps clear enough what I was trying to say, and what the distinction was that I tried to make between denial and disavowal, because actually they both have a similar effect. We can say there is some reality, and we ignore it or work in the way that we can continue to ignore it. There is denial, which is a kind of direct, I won't go into the question of what is it that can make the concrete experience for a dying person more or less better also in the sense, is it simply denial or disavowal or something else, but to keep to our examples from the social environment, like the virus that you mentioned, for instance. So there are people who simply deny the virus, and they are usually associated with conspiracy theorists who think there is this complot, and that there is this kind of the virus is not there. My point was that actually there are lots of people like this, but that what makes the world go on as if this were not the case, or as if the virus and everything else did not exist, were not so much these direct denials, which we see and who are very picturesque and very loud with their proclamations, and also very, very crazy very often, but something else that goes on in what seems to be the more rational mainstream part of the society, when the same denial or the same logic takes a very different form, precisely that of disavowal, of people who would say, yes, I know there is climate change, there is virus, but then they would have these parties like in Jonas's case, you know. These were the kind of, this is for me the disavowal. It's not people on the streets of London saying there is no virus, but the down street people who partied in the middle of the crisis, as if this, they, even though they officially proclaim all the time that there is this problem, didn't really behave or display that they seriously think there is a virus and that they are in danger. So, and similarly about the climate change, there is a lot of mainstream commotion about it, acknowledgement of the climate change, of the severe thing, but at the same time, there is still kind of not only business as usual, but now even combined with this energy crisis and so on, we even seem to go a step back to the traditional fuels and so on, fossil fuel and so on. So this was the kind of, so it's not, I'm not opposing them, I'm just I was trying to make an argument about how this, let's say, yeah, quite terrible denial that has, as you point out, also some serious consequences for the public health, if people just wouldn't admit that there is such thing as a virus, how it is not only them who are the problem, but also the way in which this denial mutates into something much less controversial, perhaps, and much less visible, but which is actually part of what makes and fuels the machine of our economy and so on, makes it push forward. So my aim was to kind of argue that one is a kind of sophisticated prolongment of the other without being actually less dangerous, although this was kind of argument. But it is also true that, you know, it's sometimes it is very interesting then that this kind of direct denial, or what we perceive are these kind of crazy theories, very often appear more on the periphery of the social, let's say, social economic landscape. Even if they appear in the States, it's not, usually it's the people who at least feel that they were kind of left out from whatever was brought that was good from the economic growth and so on. So basically the idea was to show that perhaps to bring on the table the disavowal as a Freudian psychoanalytic concept that can help us think further and also detect the same kind of destructive denial in functioning and in structures that we don't necessarily associate with it, but that present themselves also as the ones who are saving us from these crazy people and just trying to save the earth. So this was basically the argument. But thank you very much for making me clarify this point, which perhaps was not made clearly enough.
Thanks. First, I want to say if there's anyone still waiting outside, there are still some chairs here. If you want to sit. Okay. So we can still take some more questions. If you have a question, maybe you can raise your hand. If not, I can go forward and then, because I've been obsessing about one. Oh, there's one already? Sorry, I didn't see you.
Thank you, Dr. and Alenka, for this very interesting talk. I have a question. You made, you kind of distinguished between this disavowal and this denial, and how, you know, those who have kind of are experiencing this disavowal or have chosen to do so, kind of, right, the world is ending, and then we go and have a party, or we're kind of completely maybe kind of ignoring what is happening. My question is maybe on or about the people who are kind of maybe in between the people who are kind of those who are denying whatever is happening and those who have gone to kind of the disavowal side of it. Maybe there's kind of those people who kind of do acknowledge this catastrophe, this apocalypse, but then there is this kind of comfortable or maybe hopeful delegation where, well, I remember my father during the height of the COVID crisis, there was a lot of panic, but then at some point he would say, but they'll fix it. Or they'll find something out, or they'll probably have the vaccine ready by, I don't know, next year.
Which
so
did happen.
yeah, which happened. So there is this kind of, there's acknowledgement of the apocalypse, but then there's always this hopeful, this delegation of someone's going to figure it out. There's always a they in our discussions, like they'll figure it out, they'll kind of fix it for us. I don't know who they is. Sometimes it's a scientist, it's maybe, yeah, this like faith in, I don't know, Professor Dibiasky, and I don't know, finding a way to destroy that comet. So where do these people kind of lie in kind of, so they're not they're not denying, but there's also no disavowal here. So this is my question, like where do these people lie?
No, thank you very much for this question. Perhaps I will just start by answering or commenting the first comment that you made, that, okay, there are some people who accept the apocalypse and they or denied and just go on these wild parties to kind of celebrate the end. This is actually also not the people that I think kind of would fit either of the two frames. I mean, there is this kind of a orgy of, okay, we will die and let's die with, you know, it's just something. I mean, I don't even think this has to do with denial or disavowal, but perhaps and I don't think it is so much a kind of a common reaction. It could also be at the way you kind of wait for the end, okay. And the party on the Downing Street that I mentioned before was not this kind of party. For me, this was the embodiment of the disavowal, in the sense that I tried to describe it in my paper, that although these same people are warning and putting up strategies to prevent the spread of the virus, they are nevertheless behaving themselves as if the virus did not exist and cannot affect them. So it's not that they were like, well, let's die with some drinks in our heads, but it's really this kind of a perverse structure of the elite, so to say, in this case, that makes then people who look at them and see this say, okay, obviously, not only there is this difference in the so-called measures that they only are there for us, the common people who are being punished if we violate this or that decree, they can just do it. So not only there is this social difference, but also this kind of a puzzle, okay, but even if you rationally take that they are allowed to do this, but this also means that they don't really believe that they can catch the virus there. I mean, and this message, I think, is perhaps even more socially devastating and transmits. It's not just that we should rebel because they have the right to ignore the virus, to not respect the rules, and we don't, but also what is this message that they are sending, conveying to us? They are conveying to us the message that finally this is not a serious danger. So yeah, then what you say, what is with the, yeah, we are mostly, the great majority of the people is precisely, as you put it, in between this functioning. It is, we delegate, or we hope that they will find a solution, because as individuals, we are completely powerless here. It's not that we can just as by ourselves do something. And the virus was a very interesting, I mean, interesting, it's a strange word, but it was also something that kind of was articulated a little bit differently from, for instance, when you have the climate crisis, and very often you have this response, each of us individually can do this by throwing this bottle in this basket instead of this, and this will then save us from the climate. Okay, this can make some change, but this definitely is far from what we really need as global politics to prevent global warming. And with the COVID crisis, this didn't really happen. Okay, there were these individual appeals to us to protect others by wearing masks and so on, but basically it was clear that this can only be dealt with as a collective effort. At least this was the first kind of message or impact of the COVID crisis, that we cannot do this individually. And so, yeah, I think quite normally we were looking to and hoping that there is someone in charge that could deal with this. And I think it's not that we should simply stop doing this. I think to no longer expect anything from those who actually are in power is also a very dangerous game, because it's not that then we in kind of as an immediate result of this, we have the power. No, we don't have it. It's just that they will even stop pretending that they are dealing with the situation. So this can put the whole thing, plunge it into an even bigger crisis. So to some extent, we should keep looking at them and demanding them to do something and to act consistently and for the good of the majority of people. Even if we know in advance that, okay, there are many machinations that go on there, and or that they are doing it for their own profit, but nevertheless, this expectation that somebody who effectively has the power should, in these cases, do something, it should be there. But it's also true that even if this was the first, perhaps even a kind of accelerating enthusiastic moment of the COVID crisis, that again, we all of the sudden, we were aware that actually this is not global problem, but that something that concerns us as a whole, again, as a kind of community, and that there is only this kind of response that could really be efficient. Then this hopes that this could actually perhaps unexpectedly introduce some different ways of also in politics in general, was slowly or quickly disappointed because very soon we saw how this happened. The vaccines were depending largely on who is financing, who has the money, who gets them, who doesn't get them. So all these separations, divisions, segregations, differentiation, also the way, I don't know how, I mean, there are different countries implemented different measures and different ways in which to deal with the crisis. But for instance, in Slovenia, which is still supposed to be some kind of a semi-social state, but it's very interesting, you know, how these COVID supplements, I don't know if they're called supplements, what people were paid more during the COVID crisis, they actually didn't depend on the level of exposure to the virus, but on your previous salary. That is to say that, let's say, a doctor operating on someone with COVID got like 50 times more than the cleaning lady cleaning the same space after the operation. But simply because based on, though I understand there are different skills and they need to be paid, but to kind of formulate the COVID supplement based on your independent economic status, it's quite weird. I mean, we're as if, you know, those who had more money were more risking more or more physically in danger because, and all this then slowly induced in the society, in people also, all these kind of doubts, I think, and this, what is these differences re-exploded again, even through this kind of levelization, through this kind of aid, through this kind of trying to deal with it. So, and yeah, and then this hope also that they will really take care of it, or they will really help, was also kind of disappointed. And then all of immediately another crisis occurred, and so on. I mean, this is also what I said at the beginning, the serial crisis. It's kind of, it's quite strange how we then immediately almost forget about the the previous one, which was kind of a major thing, and now, okay, we moved on to something else, even if it's not really, we are not really dealt with the previous one at all. So, but yeah, this is I think the majority of us are precisely somewhere in between, and this was not meant as a kind of general psychoanalysis of the masses or of people in general, but more what I was discussing more as an attempt to formulate the kind of also the mechanism in which the social body or the social subject kind of functions. And here the majority of us precisely is not really relevant, because we don't have the power or the real capacity in this kind of configuration to but how and what would make this shift and start to function otherwise is, of course, a different kind of question. Yeah, there are
Since you're closer, you can start.
I'm sorry if I stole your mic. I apologize. Thank you. It's incredibly elucidating. I have a disciplinary question. In other words, in terms of institutionally what it means, this question, one of the questions that Nadia's putting together of this series is an interrogation of humanities and its role. And it's in the way of an observation that when I started here 20 years ago, I teach cultural history of the 20th century. And I was teaching at that point the prehistory of the present. And I've noticed that what I am teaching now is the distant past. And as you were speaking, the quote of Stephen Dedalus in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man occurred to me as history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. Mm-hmm. And whenever I teach and speak to students about cultural history, it's inevitable that I'll talk about World War I. He's in Trieste, what's going on in World War I, that the Spanish flu is after, that, there's hyperinflation in Germany after, who's on what side in World War II. My own experience as a young man, remembering the Cuban Missile Crisis in Georgia and getting under our desks. I still wish I had that desk in case there's an apocalypse. I can get under it. I'm sure it'll be useful to me. And I thought often of Lyotard's insight about the postmodern condition when he talked about the exteriorization of knowledge and the extent to which people are walking around with them now, as opposed to having something on the mental hard drive in which they can assess, is this a difference in degree or kind, the Spanish flu and the coronavirus? Is this existential threat different from the existential threat of the Cuban Missile Crisis, et cetera? However, without history as some sort of template from which to begin to make those assessments, I'm wondering the extent to which any of us, as we're teaching humanities in this more abstract way, without that kind of historical underpinning, it is possible to make those sorts of decisions. Forget denial and disavowal. People simply don't know. And into this vacuum rush, conspiracy theories, a new grand narrative, right? They're now, okay, we've reinstated grand narrative. So in the sense that this will explain what's behind everything. And by not having history as one key component in the humanities, the extent to which you think that undermines people's ability to engage in the kind of investigation of their responsibility versus elites, the extent to which they're denying what's going on or disavowing it or whatever. And that seems to me to be a key question in the humanities. So it's a long-winded question, but yeah, it was provoked by a very provocative discussion. Thank you.
No, thank you for all these comments. And I mean, I can respond to several bits and pieces, but generally, I mean, the question of the history and of this kind of knowledge of history that you brought up, I think this is precisely, or at least could be related to what I was very briefly saying at the end, namely that the end is the dead end, the impasse, which is certainly not the first time that we have find ourselves in now. So in a sense, this is a very historical moment, also in the sense that, history, and I'm not saying that it's all exactly the same. Obviously, there are important differences, but we are repeating the history in a way, in a slightly different or not really that different way. And so I don't think that these two, at least this is how I see what I'm trying to say, are really that different. I don't think that, I think the history and repetition of history and the awareness, not awareness simply in the sense of this abstract knowledge, but precisely in the sense of insisting when you are in the same impasse, not trying to simply think of something else, but precisely reimagining this impasse and kind of remembering that you've been here once already, like in a nightmare, and then perhaps like in a nightmare, try to open the other door, you know, because sometimes it works, not always, but sometimes even within the nightmare, you actually learn something. So it's a good chance if you manage to, but but otherwise, this would be like briefly just to this general question that you asked.
Hi. First of all, thank you for your insightful essay. You mentioned previously during the presentation...
sorry, I mentioned what?
You mentioned previously during the presentation that actual freedom cannot be chosen directly. So I would like to ask you, how do we understand freedom here? What is actual freedom? And when you said that, I remembered Frank Ruda's work, Abolishing Freedom. So I would like to ask you to elaborate more on this. And is it the same freedom that you both are discussing?
Thank you very much for this question, because actually the whole thinking of mine related to this question of the end actually and kind of coincidentally started when I was asked to write a response to Frank Ruda's book Abolishing Freedom. And at that point I have written just a very short essay distinguishing, which was called something Repetition and the End. And it was about precisely how there are two ways in which repetition and ending go hand in hand. One is, you know, this classical example, everybody who has a bad habit or whatever knows this, when you say, okay, but I can end it whenever I want. So there is, this idea that you can end it at any moment is actually what makes it not end, what makes you continue to do the same thing. But then there is also another modality which I drew from a very interesting novel by Italo Svevo, Coscienza di Zeno, where he is also this compulsive smoker, but for him it's not the possibility to end that sustains this repetition of the same, but it's the idea that every cigarette that he smokes, or at least almost every, he declares it to be his last one. So it's the end, and you go repeating the end, and it's actually it's there. So this is just anecdotically to say that to a large extent, this and then I have written many different things concerning these topics and concept of the end, which is not only the end of the world or of life, it could also be something much more specific and related to certain, to literature or to cinema, and so it has many different facets. But freedom, yeah, so I think the question of freedom, which I know only very vaguely, I mean, for those who are not perhaps so much into philosophy, much too abstractly touched today, is precisely to make the distinction between this what we perceive and what we are also asked to perceive today as freedom, in the sense of freedom of choice, that you are free to choose whatever, this and that, and so, and you are, and this is not the freedom that I would define as a philosophical concept of freedom, and one can even I don't know. There is some time ago. I hope I will recall it exactly. There is one episode from Sacha Baron Cohen's Who is America? You know, this show, which is very interesting again because it's quite ambiguous. First, it seems that it is a kind of a liberal staging and bashing of the prejudice against Muslims, basically because this guy comes to a very redneck town in Texas somewhere, and he presents them with his plan that they will build a great, huge mosque there. And of course, the reaction is predictable. I mean, everybody there is a community that gathers, but this guy is really, he's just like introducing them to this idea of the mosque. And he says something like, okay, people, would you like to this city to earn or to get, I don't know, $1 billion? Everybody is for it. Okay, they vote. Everybody is for it. And then the next one, okay, now this is the plan. There will be a mosque, and you have the choice between this design and that design. So who is for design A? And nobody is for design A. They are kind of upward. You say, okay, so everybody is for design B. No, nobody is for. So what do you want? So you want a design C and so on. So, but I think what, in spite of, I mean, on the one hand, you have this uprising of this whatever supposedly redneck community full of prejudices against Muslims and so on. But I think what subtly also gets across is that this is just because, not simply because they're so stupid, or perhaps they are, but it's not, it's even beyond the point, but that they also rebel simultaneously to this kind of a liberal blackmail, which doesn't give you the choice between, I don't know, mosque or no mosque, or church or no church, or whatever, but simply there is no choice there. You just have the choice between model 1, 2, 3. So you're free to choose, and this, he keeps repeating it. You're free to choose, but the other choices are completely off the table. And I think this is precisely what we are asked to believe that freedom is all about, and asked to forget that no, freedom is precisely the freedom to articulate other choices, or to even open up the space where other choices can even, I mean, not only, it's not that it's for, it's simply, to put it differently, the very structure of the choice is structured differently. And and I think what Frank Ruda is doing is in his book through this, how to call it, from the detour to the, what looks like the opposite of freedom, which is the, what is it called? The fatalism. Fatalism. So we just, there is no freedom. We just accept everything that given, and he tries to make through this detour his way back to some more fundamental meaning of the freedom. Here I would, I mean, although perhaps I take a different way, but basically this, the freedom is not simply that, it is the freedom of precisely having something or some influence on what are the choices on the table, but also, and that this is not simply always also kind of formulated as a conscious choice. You know, Immanuel Kant has this line which I think is kind of important, the transcendental choice of freedom, you know, which does not mean, okay, at some point, like empirically, I can say, okay, I have chosen this or that. But from what your choices are in life, you can kind of reconstruct your transcendental choice of freedom. And if this is the choice of freedom in the sense of Hegel or Kant, then in a way, the idea is that you can repeat this choice, that you can find an access to this choice, even now I'm speaking very simply, to make another choice. But if you don't have this moment of whatever, even transcendental choice of freedom, then if you just have what is there, then it is very difficult, if not impossible, to make freedom count in any meaningful way, and not simply to be one way in which we formulate what we like, what we don't, our pleasures, which are, okay, all nice things, but it's not actually what the notion of freedom, which is also, and this, I guess, again, is part of Ruda's argument, it should not simply be thought of as the opposite of necessity. Perhaps this is the next important point. Then if we just think freedom as the opposite of necessity, this is not really freedom. It's some kind of a chance or in a strong, like if we think seriously about our choices and the things that we really believe in, then we usually come to see that these are the things where we really think we had no choice, or we have no choice, but do it like this, in this, and not because everybody is asking or demanding us to do so, but because, and here we are free. I mean, this is the classical example of this impossible combination of freedom and necessity, is like when you fall in love, you know, you don't have a choice, but in a way you did choose it. So it's not, but then it's not something that you can say, okay, but tomorrow I will fall in love with somebody else, so that I will remain free in my choices. No, the freedom also kind of enslaves you or submits you to some kind of necessity which is meaningful in your life. It's not simply, and this thing that we should simply keep our options open and not or choose just in this superficial way, which really does not induce any necessity in the strong meaning of the term. This is precisely to come back to what I was saying, one way in which we remain slaves, in the sense that we think we are free, but really free for what? Free to do what? I mean, it's not. Yeah, of course, you can also put it in these terms, but also in a way, you know, it's also the physiology is not, yeah, it's something that comes or is subjectivized sometimes as choice and necessity. So it's not, I mean, even I think this part of ourselves, we can engage it in this choice in a way.
Good evening, Doctor.
Sorry?
Good evening. First
Good
of all,
evening,
thank
yeah.
you for being here. I just have a simple question, a quick question. So if we accept that the big capitalist governments are the main culprit for climate change, does that alleviate our personal responsibility or individual initiative to take action and solve the problem? And that implies that acknowledging the disavowalment does not really solve the problem. So what do you recommend? How can we effectively solve the problem?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have any kind of miracle solution. Obviously, many people have already thought about this. And no, I don't think what I was saying before, even if you take this on this level, okay, there is this capitalist production that is the main culprit in this climate change. And if you say, if I say that it is therefore not enough to just collect waste in this or that way, it was not to say because whatever we do, we cannot change anything. It was to say, no, because doing this does not really mean that we are engaged. This is precisely a way in which we remain, we think we are engaged, but actually we don't do that much. So in order to, and this is why this trope of being truly scared kind of comes up again and again in my talk, is that when we, so it doesn't say that we should not organize or do, but precisely on a level which is goes further or beyond this kind of individual amends or this kind of, it's almost like this Catholic confession, you confess your sins, you do this, and then you can go on making these same sins. So it's not at all to say that we should let go or that this would be that anything else is useless, but it's that precisely there is a problem to reach the level and the kind of large enough number, a community of people for a joint action with it. So it's the response is something like a organizing of people, which is, but if they are just led to take care of things individually, then I don't think this is something that could then be real or bring around some serious change in this respect. But yeah, if this. Yeah, but one last question in there, or what? You wanted to ask something? Yeah, of course. Sorry. There are others. Sorry.
I just had. I was relating this. You talked before about the death drive at one point in the analysis and about response, and I was thinking about response of the body, and also there is a form of like what we see, for example, in addiction and other forms of engaging with this. What you're talking about, the question of the end. There's also, I feel, a resistance to, like, even losing this terror. Like, it's not only about, like, even if you reach a moment of feeling the terror, I think so on some moment, like, what if this goes away and I just become normal, meaning that there's also a fear of, like, even if I want to be normal in the way, like, the functioning person in society, and even if one reaches that state where actually I can't function now, that dread comes, like, oh, this is actually not what I want to do. And
you mean if a kind of pleasure principle would just be the only?
Yeah, exactly. And pleasure principle, like, leading to the death drive and to response. So can we, like, I was thinking, like, can we think about this in relation to the possibility of maintaining a form? Of course, response will stay, and even in that experience, but there is a form of response that is geared towards death, and maybe all of it taken to its end. But I think there is a form of it, like I was thinking of it in anthropology about, I don't know if there's this book called Unlimited Intimacy. I don't know if you came across it. So it's about certain communities that exist around the world, mostly in the States, where mostly gay men who intentionally want to be infected with HIV so that they maintain a certain form of community. So they face, there's this part of it is facing this death. You have this virus and you're already gonna die, and you can enjoy yourself sexually or experience that, but it becomes very different knowing that you are no longer, there's something about the experience that changes, and maybe you all have the virus already. The virus is not HIV then, it's the virus of facing this terror maybe. But I was thinking of it as maybe their creative solution in that sense, my personal opinion. But yeah, so my question that I want to ask about you is if you can talk a bit more about how do you see the possibility of the reconfiguration of jouissance at that moment in relation to the cuts? Given that I feel, especially in Lebanon, a lot of the people I know, there's this okay, so I feel defeated. We've tried to do a revolution. We've tried to do so many things, and okay, whatever we do, there's this feel of I don't want to repeat anymore, because the button that I could press that could work maybe it doesn't exist. So I don't want to spend my life trying to press the buttons that don't work. And because of this, maybe I need to enjoy the end, and then that becomes in a way fatalistic maybe. So I know like maybe all these ideas aren't related to like one thing. I'm just trying to describe the problem with integration.
No, I think I got the gist of what you were asking. I'm not sure if I will be able to respond properly, but perhaps two thoughts. One is that in relationship to this example, that to what you started with, namely that sometimes there is this idea that, okay, but do we really want to be normal? What if this whatever strange that these things that disturb us, but also kind of make our lives spicy, disappear, then it would be even worse. My answer to this is simply that this fear of losing this is completely groundless. This will not disappear. I mean, that there is no normalcy in anywhere in the. I mean, I know the argument, but it's the other way around. You know. Again, Zizek had this great metaphor of metastasis of enjoyment. You cut it off somewhere and it reappears somewhere else. You don't worry about it that it won't reappear. It will. It surely will. And the more like all this excessively, let's say, excessively political correct modalities of regulating social life, which are there precisely in order to really put aside any possible spreads of enjoyment or of this, basically what they bring in, it's a kind of total superego enjoyment thing. So I don't think that the enjoyment is not there. It just, I think it really returns with a vengeance, because as Freud and Lacan already taught us, the law and the regulation is not simply the opposite of enjoyment, but every regulation brings with it its own enjoyment. It smuggles in, the more you want to just have these pure symbolic rules, the more numerous they are, the more numerous are these little spreads of enjoyment that keep coming back. And obviously, so the more you regulate, the more there remains to be regulated, because this kind of enjoyment also keeps getting produced in the very process of its regulation. So this was just to say that I wouldn't be, I don't go with this also sometimes it's humanist argument that, okay, but then we will, if we lose this, we will also lose our whatever good motives. No, don't worry about enjoyment. It will take care of itself. We should worry about precisely how to find, how to enjoy differently if you want. Not in different things, but that precisely this kind of dead drive, which is not really dead drive, precisely because it is much too obsessed with certain particular objects, how to make it freer, in the sense precisely that we don't, that some ways of enjoyment would become unenjoyable for us. This does not mean that everything would. So yeah, perhaps this would be the and then I lost thread a little bit. Was there something else of?
No, I think that's
okay. Okay, sorry.
Thanks a lot. Do you wanna? Thanks a lot for everyone who came today, and apologies if the space wasn't adequate enough for all the people. I think next time we're gonna expand to kind of a format that is more accommodating to everyone. And I think, yeah,
well, thank you,
to Alenka,
for
of course, and it was very good. Thank you.